Hello. We are about to read the next section of book or part 1 of Echo by Pam Munoz Ryan. So right now we're going to take a deep breath in and exhale, and we will begin. Chapter 5. "Won't you join me and the men?" asked Uncle Gunter. When the lunch whistle blew, Frederick hurried to take off his apron and grab his lunch pail. "No thanks, Uncle. I have lunch mates." Uncle Gunter shook his head, waving him off. "Your father told me about them. Go on, then. But only if I might meet them some day, or better yet, eat them for dinner." Frederick grinned and ran from the factory, knowing Uncle Gunter only teased. He skirted around the building and across a large grassy field to the edge of the pond, beyond a dense wood loomed. Frederick slipped through the shrubbery to his favorite spot, where a felled tree lay on its side. He sat down, and 3-necked grebes waddled out of the forest, rushing toward him. Frederick tossed bits of bread to his greedy friends. As he ate, a wind picked up. Dark clouds drifted overhead, obscuring the sun. The grebes' high-pitched quacking punctured the air. "Ladies, are you ready to be my audience? Please use your best concert manners," said Frederick. The grebes ignored him, chirping and pecking at the crumbs. The pines rustled in a long, drawn-out swoosh. From nearby the lumberyard, he heard the pinging of a hammer on metal. Quack, chirp, swoosh, swoosh, ping, 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 ping. Within the rhythms, Frederick heard Brahms' lullaby. He hummed the melody. He picked up a stick, closed his eyes, and lifted his arms. He pictured the orchestra. His right hand kept the tempo with the baton. His left hand cued the instruments, bouncing on an invisible plane to bring in the strings, waving in the woodwinds, flicking his wrist to usher in the brass, pointing to the harp. He opened his eyes and realized the music he heard was not only in his mind. Someone was playing a harmonica. The notes were clear, the composition complex. When he slowed the tempo, the music slowed too. When he increased, it quickened. A musician was following his direction. But from where? He looked around. There was no one about. He dropped his arms, yet the music continued. The lilt was slow, resonant, and haunting. One moment the notes sounded as if they came from a flute, the next a clarinet. In low notes, he could hear the cello. Frederick had never heard playing like this before. He listened, mesmerized, his eyes and ears searching to determine the origin of the sound. They settled on an open window on the utmost floor of the warehouse across the field. He sucked in a breath. The graveyard. Frederick had never been there, but he'd heard all the tales. It's where machines go to die. Strange things happen in the shadows. There are glimmers and apparitions. Some people go up and never come down. Frederick hesitated, but the song was so compelling, so curious. How frightening could it be? Besides, They were only rumors. He gathered his lunch, walked to the entrance, and left his pail on the threshold. Surely someone who made such music could not be a danger to him. He opened the heavy door and stepped inside the foyer. The music came from far above. Slowly he climbed the dim stairwell. At the top floor, Frederick pushed open a door and entered a cavernous room. Floor to ceiling, arched windows ran down either side, but only a few needle-like gleams of light penetrated the years of grime on the glass, leaving the room in shadows. Old machines, bulky figures of steel and iron, filled the space. On the ceiling, dozens of wheels had been suspended, and below them, on the floor, or attached to tables, were their counterparts. All the elements of a once elaborate police system. The leather belts, now disconnected and useless, dangled from the rafters like black snakes. It's where machines go to die. The music was louder now, but there was still no sign of a musician. The stale, dusty air made Frederick sneeze. The music stopped. "Hello?" he called. His words echoed. "Hello, hello." A mouse skittered across his path. The refrain from the lullaby picked up again. It seemed to come from the far corner of the room. The music was so insistent that it pulled him forward. Tears sprang to his eyes. Who played so beautifully with such passion? He maneuvered around the deformed skeletons of machines. A large contraption covered with a dingy oilcloth blocked his view of the corner. He edged around it. Again, music stopped. He called out, "Please show yourself." Once more he heard the lullaby. He peered into the dimness at the spot where he was certain the song had originated. No one was there. Frederick went to the window he had seen from the field. He was sure it had been open. But now it wasn't. The glass was dirty and opaque like all the others. Spiderwebs draped the corners. The floor was covered with an undisturbed carpet of dust. No one had stood there for some time. Glimmers and apparitions. Was it a ghost he'd heard? Or someone playing a trick on him? Frederick turned and studied the immense space. There was only one way he had entered. No one could have slipped by him without notice. He turned to the window again. A wooden, claw-footed desk sat in front of it. He leaned across it and rubbed at the grime on the glass, creating a portal. He could see the felled tree where he'd eaten lunch and the grubs nearby. This was the right window. He tried to latch and, as he did, bumped the desk. Something rattled. Frederick opened the top drawer. Inside was a harmonica box. He picked it up and studied the lid. Marine Band, made by M. Hohner, Germany. Number 1896, 1896. He opened it and removed the model that the company usually exported to the United States of America. The date on the box indicated the year it was introduced, but the cover plate looked newer and the body older. Opposite the side with the blowholes on the black painted edge was a tiny red letter M. Was this instrument someone had been playing? If so, how? He had heard music, hadn't he? He felt a chill and shivered, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The factory whistle droned. Frederick jumped. Strange things happen. Some people go up and never come down. Quickly, he put the harmonica back in the box, slipped it into his chest pocket, and retraced his steps through the room. He scrambled down the stairs, tumbling the last few steps until he burst out the door. He had to bend over for a minute to catch his breath before grabbing his lunch pail and running back to his building. "Nephew, what happened? You look pale as a ghost," said Uncle Gunter when Frederick reached his table. "I may have heard one," said Frederick, putting on his apron and describing what had just happened. "There's a logical explanation," said Uncle Gunter. "The sound of music is like water finding a path. It travels in many directions. It might have amplified sound coming from a different floor in the building." Frederick wasn't so sure. The music had felt so present, as if the harmonica wanted him to find it. "Do you suppose I could keep it?" "I don't see why not. The company gives us several each year." Frederick stepped closer and pointed to the red M. "What do you make of this?" Uncle Gunter studied it. "It looks like a craftsman mark, but it's not customary to do such a thing. It won't affect the sound. The instrument looks in good shape. Cover plate's been changed. There's no telling how long it was in the desk. Probably belonged to an employee from years ago. You'll want to clean it and tune it." Uncle Gunter clapped him on the back. "Frederick, my boy, you'll be a hero if the men found out you went to the graveyard alone. Most of them wouldn't dare." As he walked home that evening, Frederick pulled the harmonica from his pocket and lifted it to his lips. He blew a few chords. Uncle Gunter was right. It was out of tune. But for now, Frederick didn't mind. He played the first few notes of Alle Vogel sind schon da. All the little birds are back. The harmonica had a rich, ethereal quality, the same alluring sound he'd heard earlier in the graveyard room. The more he played, the more air around him seemed to pulse with energy. He felt protected by the cloak of the music, as if nothing could stand in his way. Was he just excited that Elizabeth was coming home and his family would be together again? Or was it something else? He became so entranced by the tone of the harmonica and the simple, hypnotic song that he'd passed the schoolyard before he remembered to feel anxious. He turned down his own block and realized he'd walked almost all the way home without hunching over. He didn't even mind that Mrs. von Gerber, their next-door neighbor, who always bothered him with gossip or home remedies for his birthmark, was out sweeping in front of her geranium boxes. Instead of avoiding her as usual, he called out, "Hello, Mrs. von Gerber." She stopped and stared in surprise. "Good evening, Frederick." He waved and slipped the mysterious harmonica in his pocket. With every step on the front walk, it seemed to thump against his chest like a heartbeat. Chapter 6. Frederick was embraced by the aroma of roasted meat and cinnamon apples. He grinned as he hung up his coat on the hall tree. Then he rubbed his hands together with anticipation. The old cuckoo clock, with its carved pine cone weights, hugged the wall. The tiny door, in a wreath of lindenwood leaves and forest animals, opened. The cuckoo slid forward and chirped the hour. "Too bad, old friend," said Frederick. "You cannot enjoy our meal." "I'm in here," a voice called from the kitchen. Frederick found Father at the table and Elizabeth facing the stove, stirring something meaty with a wooden spoon. An apron was tied at her waist over a gray skirt and white blouse. Frederick's eyes swept the small kitchen. The walnut hutch with his mother's collection of hand-painted saucers, the counter with the tin canisters sitting in descending order, the window with the green shutter, and Elizabeth finally home. He rushed up behind her, put his arms around her waist, and lifted her off the floor. "Frederick, put me down." Father laughed. Frederick released her. "Did you miss me, Lisbeth?" She was almost 18, taller than Frederick, but not by much, with the same blue eyes as his father's. Her blonde hair hung long and loose, and her dimpled cheeks were flushed pink with the warmth of the room. Fresh bread sat on the board on the table. Spatzel rested in the pan. A strudel, dusted with sugar, cooled on the back of the stove. Frederick reached around to tug on her apron string. She dodged him, laughing, and threatened him with a spoon. "Have you tried to scrub off a patient's birthmark with a shoe brush yet?" he asked. She put her hands on her hips. "Will you ever forget that?" "I don't forget easily. Remember when we used to play hide and seek, and if you found me before I was safe, your reward was to bandage me like a mummy?" Father nodded. "Even then you were a nurse." Last year, Elizabeth went to Stuttgart to live with their only relatives besides Uncle Gunter, Mother's cousin and his wife, and their daughter, Margarethe, who is in nursing school too. But now Elizabeth's last 3 months of training would be in a local hospital with their family physician, Dr. Braun. "It is good to have you home," said Frederick, saluting. "I'm ready to be ordered about." Elizabeth pointed the spoon towards the chair. "Sit next to Father, and I will bring you the spatzel. Father, you start. Tell me about your last days at work and your first days as a man of Golden Age." At the kitchen table, Father talked about all the congratulations and good-natured kidding he'd taken during the last weeks of work, and the dinners and lunches to honor him. He talked about starting a small chamber ensemble of musicians. "Of course, it won't be as lively as our little performances in the parlor. I'm counting on hearing a polka on the piano later." She looked at Frederick and rolled her eyes. "What about you?" "Father submitted my application to the conservatory." "He will perform for the jury in January. I can tell he's apprehensive," said Father. "Talk to him, Elizabeth." "Of course you must. It's what you've always wanted," said Elizabeth. "What is your worry?" Frederick shrugged. It wasn't clear what worried him. "The jury is only 8 people," said Father. It was easy for Father to say. He wasn't the one who had to stand in front of strangers and pretend there was nothing wrong with his face and perform. And if he was accepted, what then? Would he be able to sit in a classroom with students he'd never met? Even if he could endure the furtive glances and downward cast eyes, what would be the point anyway? How could he stand in front of an audience or dare to conduct an entire orchestra? The idea made his stomach churn. "They will be happy. They will be lucky to have your talent," said Elizabeth. "And now more than ever, Germany needs its true citizens to rise to their potential, to be shining examples." Father frowned. "Well, yes, that's one rationale, but—" "And what of your work at the hospital?" Frederick didn't want to talk about the conservatory, and he sensed an argument brewing between Father and Elizabeth. "It's going well. I observed a reconstructive surgery the other day on a small boy's lip. It was thrilling. I hope to work in pediatric surgery someday." Frederick noticed that she'd taken only a few bites of her food and had worried her napkin into a ball. "Lisbeth, what's wrong?" She looked from father to Frederick. She set down her napkin, folded her hands in front of her plate, and took a deep breath. "Before Uncle gets here, there's something I have to tell you both. I hope you will understand." She sat up straighter. "I've been reassigned to a Berlin hospital. I won't be staying in Trossenberg or working with Dr. Braun."
"Berlin?" Father's eyes twitched with disappointment. "Why, it was all arranged that you'd be here."
"Yes, I know," said Elizabeth. "I only found out a few days ago. Dr. Braun has already been notified."
Frederick stared at his plate, his heart sinking. There'd be no late-night talks, or passing a novel back and forth, or Sunday afternoons playing binochle. He looked at Father, not knowing if he felt worse for himself or him. Father's face had wilted. "How long can you stay?"
"Only the weekend. I leave Monday morning on the earliest train."
"But we've seen so little of you." Father blinked back tears.
"I know this comes as a surprise, Father, and I'm sorry for that, but this position will be good for my career inside and outside the hospital." "Can't you talk to someone and plead your case for Trossingen?" said Frederick.
"No,
I requested to be reassigned."
For a few moments there was only the sound of the cuckoo clock ticking in the hall. Father's face wrinkled with confusion. "Requested it?"
"Why?" asked Frederick.
Hadn't she wanted to be with them?
"So much has changed for me. Berlin is the center of many of my activities now. I should have told you last time I was home, but there never seemed the right moment. You see, after I moved to Stuttgart, Marguerite and I joined the League of German Girls."
Father's head snapped back as if he'd been slapped. "Elizabeth, you cannot be serious." Frederick choked on his schwatzel.
"You're a Hitlerite?"
Chapter 7. Was his sister sitting across from him at dinner table, or was it some other creature?
"Don't say Hitlerite with such disdain," said Elizabeth. "But yes, the League is the girls' division of Hitler Youth. We advocate traditional German music, literature, and values."
"Instead of," said Father.
"Well, non-traditional things. For instance, the harmonica. I'm sorry to say, it is not considered traditional and thought to be offensive."
"The harmonica," said Frederick, laughing. "It is responsible for our livelihood, Elizabeth," said Father. "It's what enables you to go to school and live in Stuttgart with Marguerite. Let's not disparage an instrument that goes back to the ancient Chinese Shen."
"But Father, even you don't play it."
"But I play," said Frederick, pulling the harmonica he'd found in the graveyard from his pocket and holding it up. "In the harmonica club."
"It's not the instrument itself," said Elizabeth. "It's the type of music people play on it. Unacceptable music."
"What do you mean?" said Frederick.
"I mean black music, jazz. It's considered degenerate."
"Music does not have a race or a disposition," said Father.
Every instrument has a voice that contributes. Music is a universal language, a universal religion of sorts. Certainly, it's my religion. Music surpasses all distinctions between people. Some do not agree, Father, and we should follow the Nazi Party's guidelines. We should not listen or play music by Jewish composers. Don't be ridiculous, said Father. The cuckoo clock warbled. Hush, cuckoo, muttered Frederick, unless you wish to be mocked. Not at all, said Elizabeth. The Black Forest clocks are particular to German craftsmen. Hitler advocates German pride, and we should endorse him. After all, he is our chancellor. But Hindenburg is still our president, said Father, slamming a palm on the table. Everyone says Hitler will be our president soon enough. He is the answer to our country's problems, Father, and the Nazi Party is the only acceptable political party in Germany now. Have you read his book, Mein Kampf? Asked Father. Elizabeth looked directly at Father, steely-eyed. Frankly, no. Intellectualism is frowned upon. Hitler is the leader of the working man, of the common people, of true Germans. I am well versed in his hopes for the country, his ideology, and he wants a pure race, said Father. He says all non-Germans are his enemies. Elizabeth looked at Father as if she pitied him. Father, he is only trying to encourage national pride. The League is a wholesome organization for healthy girls of true German heritage. How do you prove that? Asked Father. Baptism records, health records, marriage notices. Anyone can join if they can prove that there is not 1/8 of a certain non-German ancestries in their bloodline. It is not as questionable as you think, and there are worse things than being a true German. She turned to Frederick. You must join the Hitler Youth. You would be with boys your own age from our neighborhood. There are meetings and rallies and outdoor competitions. It is such fun. Frederick touched his face. Had Elizabeth forgotten how boys his own age from their own neighborhood had treated him? And what about Hitler's plan to cleanse the population? Would Frederick qualify as true German? Was he pure enough? Softly he said, I don't think they would like the way I look. Oh, but you should ignore your pride, Frederick. It's important that all Germans come together for the fatherland, for the good of the country and the common man. It struck Frederick that almost word for word, Elizabeth sounded like Anselm. Had they been together at the same meetings? Frederick will not be taking that chance, said Father. Father, you are stubborn and unreasonable. At least Marguerite, I have support at her house. She understands and shares my feelings, as do her parents. Her parents? Asked Father. Elizabeth raised her chin. They were the ones who suggested we go to our first meeting. Father's face pinched and he slumped back in his chair. Our own relatives. This is how you spend your time. My league work is only Wednesday nights and Saturdays, said Elizabeth, and it has given me a much higher standing with the doctors and nurses. She pushed her chair away from the table and stood up. Father, I love it. We go hiking on outings. We sing. I am involved in the community, helping people. They value me because of my medical training. I am already in the youth medical service. And I am determined to become a leader, to set an example for the younger girls.
You are starry-eyed, said Father. Elizabeth ignored him.
I won't be home much because, as a potential youth leader, my extra time will be devoted to the league. Father, I need my baptism papers. And yours and mother's, or notices of marriage, and any of my grandparents', if by some miracle you have them. Oh, that would be wonderful. If we had those records, I could prove my lineage that far back, then I might be guaranteed a leadership position. Leadership? His sister was going to train others to be followers of Hitler? There was a knock at the front door. There's Uncle Gunter with his accordion. No doubt, said Elizabeth. Maybe he'll be more excited for me. She hurried from the kitchen. Father stood and muttered, Uncle Gunter will not be more excited. I'm going to bed. Don't you want strudel? Said Frederick. And what about playing some music? As Father walked from the room, he said, I have a sour stomach. A few moments later, Uncle Gunter came into the kitchen with an arm around Elizabeth. At last, Frederick, we're all together again. Frederick pulled a chair out at the table for Uncle Gunter. Yes, all together, except for Father, who asked to be excused. His stomach. Ah, too bad, but all the more for me, he said, eyeing the dessert. Elizabeth served the strudel and chatted away, her face animated, unconcerned about Father's absence or Frederick's mood. At first, Uncle Gunter was genial and asked questions about Elizabeth's work. Then, with each of her revelations, Frederick watched him grow more and more quiet. Set down the half-eaten dessert he loved and excused himself early, feigning tiredness. He put on a coat and picked up his accordion. Before he left, Uncle Gunter looked at Frederick. His eyes filled with something Frederick couldn't decipher. Pity, or fear, or apprehension? Was he worried for Elizabeth, or for Frederick, or for Father? Chapter 8. Early the next morning, Frederick found Father sitting in the parlor, slumped in a chair. He looked small and was withered, as if all the air had been squeezed from his body. In his lap, he held a fabric-covered hat box. Papers and photos were strewn around him. The box slid on the floor. Father, what is all of this? The papers Elizabeth asked for. Why? If you don't give them to her, she won't be able to become a leader, and maybe she will come to her senses. Frederick, they are all public records. If she does not get them from me, she might solicit copies through a lawyer. I can't help but think she was unduly influenced. Father shook his head. Our own relatives. Father held up several documents. Here are the baptism and marriage records she needs. I finally found them. He nodded to the rounded box. I never looked inside, always thought it held a hat. I haven't looked through any of these since your mother. Father looked down, rubbing his forehead with his fingers. Too painful, I suppose. Where's Elizabeth? Asked Frederick. Visiting next door with Mrs. von Gerber. She'll know more about Trossingen than we do by the time she returns. Put everything back in the box for me, will you? And take it to my room. I have a student coming soon, but I need a cup of tea first. Father headed to the kitchen. Frederick collected the photos. He stopped at a portrait of Father at about 12 years old, standing next to his cello. Frederick was startled by their resemblance. He touched the photo. How would his life have been different if he had been born without a birthmark? Like Father. In another photo of a school orchestra, he found Father in the cello section, first chair, but his eyes settled on the young conductor standing in front and holding his baton. Would that ever be him? He put the photographs in his pocket, to prop on the dresser later. Then he gathered the rest with the papers and stacked them in a hat box on an envelope. An envelope had been affixed to the underside of the lid. He pulled out a piece of paper. On it was an ink impression of an infant's footprints. At the bottom was his name, Frederick Martin Schmidt. Below that, his birth date, followed by the words, cause of death, epilepsy. His heart skipped. He read it again. It was his name and his birth date, so they had to be his footprints. But he wasn't an epileptic, and he was very much alive. Who had written this? Why did they say he was dead? His hand shook as he studied the tiny impressions. He hadn't heard the front door open, but Elizabeth was standing before him, taking off her scarf. As usual, Miss von Gerber knows everything about everybody, so it was easy to catch up on the neighborhood in one sitting. She was excited about my assignment in Berlin and happy to report that Dr. Braun is extremely pleased one of his own patients is going into medicine, even if I can't intern with him. She said she's missed my quince jam, but I promised to make her some soon and send it to her. Elizabeth put her hands on her hips and stared at Frederick. What's wrong? You look pallid. He held out the paper. As soon as she read it, her mouth opened, but no words came out. Finally, she said, It must be a mistake. It's my birth date and my name, he said. Frederick, there must be an explanation. Come. In a daze, Frederick followed her to the kitchen, where Father stood at the basin, filling the tea kettle. Father? Asked Elizabeth. She held the paper out to him. He studied it, confused at first. Then recognition came over him. Where did you find this? Frederick found it. Father nodded. It's been so long I've forgotten. Why does it say I'm dead? Asked Frederick. Father looked from him to Elizabeth. I can explain. Please, sit down. And that is where we will end our reading today.